Fatoumata is Senegalese. She now lives in Paris. She was one of the founding, the 5 founders of a company called Jumia, which you may have heard of because it is widely considered the most successful startup ever in Africa. It was started in 2012.
Yeah.
It started pretty much simultaneously in Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Ivory Coast, and South Africa. Very ambitious, and it paid off because it's the largest e-commerce company in Africa,
Absolutely.
right? So, but before that, she grew up in sort of a middle-class family in Senegal. Her father worked for USAID, among other places. Also, what was the other thing he worked for? When you went to Togo, who was he working for?
He was working in international organizations and in programs that were focusing on reproductive health mainly.
Right. So she comes from a family of, educated but not wealthy people. She was a super good student in both Senegal and Togo, where she lived for part of the time. And then she got a scholarship to one of the great universities of France, right? And the rest is history, because she was a great student. She became a major management consultant in France, and then she decided to drop that and move back to Africa and try to make a difference. And that's when, through a chain of events, she co-started Jumia. And now Django is a venture capital firm that she runs that's raising its second fund. And it invests only in Africa, only in companies that are at least 50% women leadership. And maybe you should just start by telling us, why are you doing that?
Well, thank you for having me, David. When I learned that the theme for this year was Innovation Must Save the World, I felt that I had to be part of the conversation, because it's actually the reason why I first became an entrepreneur and then became an impact investor. And to put things in perspective, we might all know that today we are roughly 1.2 billion people in Africa. But in the next 30 years, we'll be adding 1.3 billion people, so it'll be 2.5 billion. And I don't think if you get it, but no other region in the world had faced such a fast increase and such a large increase in such a little time. So for instance, it took Europe more than 150 years to go from 250 to 750 million inhabitants. It will take China roughly 100 years, they are not there yet, to go from 500 to 1.5 billion people. And it took us first 30 years to triple, and it's taking us another 30 years. Which means that it will creating very massive challenges in terms of how fast we need to create jobs for people, because 70% of our population is below 25 years old. So in the next 30 years, we need to create 900 million jobs. But we also need to feed these people. We need to provide them healthcare. We need to provide them quality education, and so on and so forth. And to me, technology, at the same time, is one of the most massive opportunities that Africa has today. I was sharing yesterday during the opening roundtable that we actually have more mobile devices, or more mobile SIM cards than even people on the continent, because you have really a leapfrog effect. And the world's largest success story when it comes to, for instance, mobile financial services, it's not in the Silicon Valley, it's not in China, it's not in Japan, it's actually in Africa. Where we are using, 93%, for instance, of Kenyan use mobile financial services. And to me, tech can be a very powerful way to leapfrog development. Entrepreneurship is the most massive way for us to be able to create jobs at scale, especially for young people and for women. And that's why first I decided to become an entrepreneur 10 years ago. So that the thesis was really tech can help broaden an access to products for the African middle class. I was mentioning yesterday, for instance, we have, for every 400 American, you have one retail shop. For every 60,000 African, you have one retail shop, right? So if you do the maths, you can see that the potential was massive, and that's what had enabled us to be today the largest e-commerce platform in Africa. But beyond access to good, I felt that we needed really to accelerate more, and I see also so many massive opportunities in Africa today. So basically, I don't know if you have that in mind, but when you look at the 10 fastest growing economy for the past 10 years, every year, 6 to 7 are African countries, right? If you look at the world's largest, lowest actually default rate for infrastructure financing, it's actually in Africa, because usually I hear a lot that Africa is risky or corrupted, and actually I feel that there is a very big misunderstanding of where we are today, and there is a very strong perception of risk, a very strong underestimation of opportunity and the scale of the opportunities today. And that's why I'm excited to be part of this conversation and run you through some concrete ways where we can leapfrog. But that being said, I feel that the sense of urgency needs to be a bit stronger, because despite innovation showing great potential, Africa only represents today less than 1% of the global VC funding, when we are more than 15% of the world's population. So we have some challenges ahead as well, and I hope that collectively we can have some ideas to accelerate the speed and the scale of those innovations.
So there's an element of just elementary financial justice in what you're trying to accomplish. Talk a little bit about some of the companies that you're involved in, the kind of companies that are emerging in Africa, and what their opportunity is.
Well, I can give you so many examples. So we focus on three things. One, on platforms that have the potential to accelerate and massify access to essential services. It can be financial services, it can be healthcare, it can be education, and it can be even energy. And what's quite fascinating within or beyond my portfolio is, for instance, in the West, you might believe that you need to have energy to be able to have access to internet. In Africa, it's actually the other way around. So you, for instance, have a startup in East Africa called M-Kopa. And what they do is they realize that because so many Africans are not unbanked, they can't afford having the on-grid energy, access to energy. So they developed mobile-based energy solution, which is solar, which is pay-as-you-go, which makes energy affordable to them. And today, thanks to them, you have hundreds of thousands of African households who have access to energy. Similarly, I can give you, an example in terms of, for instance, healthcare. During the COVID pandemic, my team and I witnessed, and you all witnessed, a shortage of medical supplies. So we started with test kits. And when we started our work, African Center of Disease Control, the Africa CDC, was mentioning that we only had 10 million test kits for Africa between May and September 2020, which means roughly 46,000 test kits per country and per month, which is insane, right? So in a matter of 6 weeks, we put together a team and seeded a platform to be able to provide to African governments, African hospitals, and big labs access to international suppliers, first starting with test kits, soon starting with drugs, and then now with vaccines. And to date, that platform is transacting on a yearly basis more than $2 billion worth of medical supplies. It has already shipped at least one medical supply to each and every of the 54 African countries. In fact, it was so innovative that we even had Caribbean countries who were facing the same shortage applying, and today you have 11 Caribbean countries, including Barbados, including Jamaica, that are also using it to be able to get access to medical supplies. The platform has been founded, for instance, by Gates Foundation. It's expanding beyond the COVID pandemic to be able to tackle other healthcare emergencies. And it's something extremely powerful on how technology on one hand and capital on the other hand can solve something which is an emergency situation. And I have so many other examples. So for instance, I have a sheer passion on SMEs, small and middle enterprises. They are not very sexy in the Silicon Valley, but to me, they are essential because they are the real economy. For instance, when it comes to trade, 80% of African trade today is informal, which means that instead of having a big Walmart or instead of going to my e-commerce marketplace that I co-founded, basically they go to small mom-and-pop store owners. And you have roughly 10 million of them on the whole continent. In Nigeria only, you have 1.5 million of them. A little less than 2 years ago, I invested in a company called Sabi in Nigeria that is female-founded. And less than 2 years after, you have more than 200,000 of these small retailers that are going on Sabi to have access to FMCG brands at a better price.
Access to what?
Fast-moving consumer goods brands. So it can be sugar, oil, groceries, so staples that Africans need in their households, right? So 200,000 SMEs going on one platform have a better access to large volumes, better prices, trackable supply. And what is quite fascinating is they have been roughly transacting now $500 million a year, so it's quite big. But beyond that, the fact that these small and medium enterprises were able to transact online, it built a kind of credit scoring for them because banks were not lending them money to be able to scale. And thanks to that now, they can have either SABI or third-party funding providers be able to de-risk their investment because they have a track record of sales. They have also sales forecasts that can be made through the platform. And they are also using SABI even to orchestrate their logistics, which is very, very important. And another example I want to give, for instance, is an investment that we made in Côte d'Ivoire 4 years ago. It's called Jexport. It's like
Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast.
Ivory Coast in West Africa. It's like a Flexport, but for Africa. And the reason why it's important, I'm not someone who studied logistics, for instance, but I'm passionate about logistics. The reason is, in the US, the cost of logistics compared to a cost of goods sold, let's say your phone, is roughly between 6 and 7%, right? In Africa, the cost of logistics compared to the cost of the goods sold is up to 75% in East Africa. We surveyed actually export-ready SMEs in Côte d'Ivoire because we have a partnership with the Ministry of Industry, Trade, and SMEs Promotion. And it turns out that export-ready companies had a 55% cost of logistics, right? So we are not solving for infrastructure, but then we were solving for optimizing supply and demand because with a marketplace for logistics, you can, for instance, make sure that one corridor can match the other corridor in terms of volumes. And with logistics, the beauty is the larger the volumes, the lower the costs, right? And for instance, if I take some countries like Mali and Burkina, they are also in West Africa, they don't have access to sea. And Côte d'Ivoire has access to sea. So from Mali to Côte d'Ivoire, one way will be 1/6 the volume of the other way. And when we've seen that, we were like, okay, we can consolidate small SMEs to make both corridors even, and you see a price reduction by more than 30%. And it's very, very important because beyond giving competitiveness to these SMEs locally, it helps them also to be more competitive for export. And that's very important for us because Africa is today less than 5% of the global trade. Another example I want to give is in Senegal, for instance. We invested in a company called Fleety recently, a little less than 18 months ago. And what they do is through fleet management services, they are able to reduce fuel consumption by more than 30%.
Reduce what?
Fuel consumption, gas consumption.
Oh, fuel,
yeah,
yes.
Fuel.
Yes.
I'm a French
little
speaker,
accent
so
issue here. I got to just make sure I
right?
can understand it so they can understand it. Go on.
So absolutely. So they were reducing 30% their fuel consumption.
Fuel.
And were able to lower carbon emissions, right? So here the impact is not only double bottom line, it's actually triple bottom line. And what I'm the most, I think, proud of is, what's the commonality between all these companies? They're either female-founded and female-led, or have more than 50% of the team, including senior leadership, that is made of female. And that's something that's very, very close to my heart, as you know.
And a lot of these companies do have a sustainability piece almost intrinsically.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do actually is before even we invest, so we are an impact investor. So actually our largest investors are today development finance institutions. So for instance, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the private sector arm of the French Development Agency. And the reason why is, as I mentioned, the reason why we exist is basically to be able to prepare for that future. Actually, Django means future in Fulani, which is my mother's native language, because basically we need now to prepare for that future where we provide massive access to Africans to all the service they need, massive access to SMEs, to markets, and with a better, competitiveness, and while doing so, creating jobs at scale. And here as well, we see that e-commerce in general, but tech overall has a lot of potential. To give you maybe some numbers, I mentioned we need to create 900 million jobs in the next 30 years. Where we are today is every year we create 3 million net jobs, right? So we need to create between 20 and 30 to get to the 900 million that we need. And
so you're making 3 million now, you need 20 or 30 jobs per year.
Absolutely. And to give you, for instance, there is a study from BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, that shows that only e-commerce, I'm not talking about even broader tech, can create 3 million net jobs by 2025, right? So we are really, for me, it's kind of a leap of faith, and that's really something that is embedded in our thesis. So basically, when we see a portfolio company, not only we are able to invest financially, but what we do is to also assess the potential for impact. So for instance, we map every of our investments against sustainable development goals. We also assess the potential for job creation with a focus on jobs for young people, jobs for women, and also green jobs. And this is something that is systematic to us, right? So it's really fascinating, but what I have to mention is that it's not enough. To me, it's very paradoxical that Africa only represents less than 1% of the global VC funding. I keep talking about 2050, but if I even give you some data points about today, I like to make the comparison between, for instance, Africa and India, right? We have roughly the same population today, 1.2, 1.3 billion.
Africa and India,
Absolutely.
roughly the same population. Yeah.
Absolutely. We also have roughly the same GDP, actually, $3 trillion.
Same GDP.
Yeah. You have actually more internet users, more mobile devices, more mobile financial users in Africa than in India, but we attract between 8 and 20 times less money. And I think that has a lot to do with the overestimation of risk and underestimation of opportunity, right? So, and today we already have more internet users than the US. We already have more internet users than Europe. And in 2050, we'll have 1 billion. It will be 3 times more than the US, twice more than Europe. So there is some opportunity here, and we need to see more direct investment, whether it is foreign or domestic, overall. But we absolutely need to see more investment funding critical innovation. And the good news, it's not only going to benefit us. I think when we're doing the prep call, we're also talking about the potential of the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
So we can maybe take a few seconds to talk about
most
it.
people here have, how many people know that there's a giant free trade agreement under negotiation in Africa right now? Not, okay, one hand.
Yeah. All right.
It's
so
huge.
It's pretty huge. So what's happening is that we have almost all countries, including the giants, so Nigeria, South Africa, etc., that have ratified what we call the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And when it's fully effective, you'll have the world's largest single market with 2.5 billion people, $8 trillion GDP. So beyond investing for equality or investing to leapfrog development, there is actually an opportunity because Africa will be the largest frontier market for your companies. So for me, it's both a responsibility morally, but it's also an opportunity. And that's why it's important to see, for me, more impact investors coming on the continent. Because I don't see a situation where we can have the same model as in the Silicon Valley, right? I love going to San Francisco. I'm mesmerized by the innovation. I'm fascinated by the level of funding. But I'm also quite sad to see that tech there is not bridging inequality. Sometimes it's increasing inequality. I come from a third world country, but I've never seen so many homeless people or people struggling with addictions in the streets, right? So this can't work for us. And that's why we need to find a model, and we have it, but we need it at a much larger scale, where you have the economic profits, because we need some commercial investors. It can't be only funded by development finance institutions. And returns are there, and there are ways to de-risk. At the same time, we need that tech and that profits to be having a strong purpose, to be creating more equality, to be positive socially, to be positive for the environment. And to me, it's not wishful thinking, right? At some point, when you were wondering why I choose this career path, sometimes I'm challenging myself, should I not go and work for the African Development Bank? But to me, it won't come from public sector. It won't come from this kind of institution. It will come from the private sector. Yesterday, someone mentioned that, and it's even more true in Africa. I lived, for instance, in Nigeria, in Lagos. You have 20 million people there. And because the population is increasing so fast, the federal government is not able to provide basic services and essential services. So it's done by these small and medium enterprises. It's the only country where I lived where I had to find myself my source of power, my source of clean water. And this is a tremendous challenge, but some entrepreneurs are tackling it, and to them it's an opportunity today.
We are pretty much out of time, but if somebody has a question, I'd love to take at least one question. Does anybody want to ask this incredibly impressive person a question? Nobody does. Well, you know, you can tell that you used to be a management consultant. You have data up the wazoo, and it's really informing action, and that is incredibly impressive. And just to underscore how impressive her work is, Fatou was supposed to stay here till tomorrow, but she has to leave at around lunchtime today because Bill Gates wants to have a meeting with her, but he's in Kenya and he wants her to come to see him. So this is the kind of person that I feel represents the future of the world, really. And somebody's got their hand up now, but really fast.
When you refer to Africa, Africa is a huge continent with many different peoples and many different countries. Are you referring to the entire continent when you're talking about Africa? Or is there a specific section of Africa that you are focusing your efforts on?
So I think that's a great question. I refer to Africa overall, but in the way I invest, I actually really segregate. So to your point, for instance, when we look at funding globally in Africa, I mentioned that Africa overall is less than 1% of the global funding. But then, within the 1%, between 70 and 9% of the funding is actually going to 4 countries: Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. And when we're talking about how can tech or venture capital be driving more equality, I picked 2 areas of focus. One is gender-wise. We mentioned it earlier, but you actually have in Africa the highest entrepreneurship activity rate for female entrepreneurs at roughly 27% globally. Actually, the country in the world where you have the highest rate of entrepreneurs that are female is Ghana. Yet we have a $42 billion funding gap. And if I look at the numbers for 2020, for the first semester, African female investors only raised 11% of the global money. So my portfolio is 56% female-led, which show that it's possible. Similarly, I mentioned 70 to 90% of the funding is going to 4 large Anglophone economies. I gave you example talking about Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and my portfolio is actually 54% Francophone. And it can go on and on and on. So you have, for instance, more late-stage money than early stage, and that's why I focus from seeds to growth. I invest between 50K and 5 million, because below 50K you have angels, and after 5 million you have PE. In between you have almost no one.
We do have to wrap, but you're currently raising money for your second fund, right? Are you looking for investors?
Well, absolutely. We hit actually first close of what is today the largest gender equal tech fund in Africa. And we'll, of course, be excited to get like-minded, like-valued partners, mostly, to get us to the second close and keep doing what we do.
Thank you, Fatou.
Thank you,
So good
David.
to have you.